The Lazarus Effect is a 2015 horror film starring Mark Duplass, Olivia Wilde, Sarah Bolger, Evan Peters and Donald Glover, you might know as Troy from Community, I hope you do know that. And it's also directed by David Gelb, who you might know as the director of Gyro Dreams of Sushi, a critically acclaimed documentary that I haven't yet seen. But obviously this film's a bit of a departure for the director, and the question is, does it hold up? If you've seen any of the coverage for this film, any of the critical reception, you're probably expecting me to absolutely destroy this movie and rip it to shreds, because it has done awfully in terms of reviews and didn't make that much at the box office either, but it had such a low budget it really didn't matter. It has a 5.1 on IMDb, 14% on Rotten Tomatoes and 31 on Metacritic. That is ridiculously bad. And I went into this film, I watched it on a bit of a whim. I was looking for something short. It's pretty short, it's about 83 minutes long. So I watched it on a whim, expecting it to be crap. And that's unfair, because it really isn't as bad as people are saying, and I don't really understand why people are saying that. Actually, that's not technically true. I can understand sort of where people are coming from, so I'll get into that in a minute. But firstly, the plot. The plot, as the title might suggest, if you know your Bible stuff, and even if you don't, you've heard it enough anyway. Mass Effect, Mass Effect. If you know anything, you'll know that the Lazarus was a character from the Bible who got resurrected, blah, blah, blah. So this movie is about resurrection, and there's a group of scientists, young scientists, who are trying to work on resurrection in order to give people and doctors more time to cure the diseases of the people they are operating on. It all starts out quite noble, and it is honestly quite an interesting premise. I found the main character, played by Mark Duplass, called Frank, I found him to be quite charismatic and a likeable character, if not particularly deep, and he is going out with Olivia Wilde, who plays a character called Zoe. And due to various events, which I won't get into, she dies fairly early on in the film. It's not a spoiler for me to tell you that. I won't spoil how it happens, but she does die. And obviously they've been working on this experiment which they have tested on a dog and successfully brought him back to life. But the problem is that they've seen that the dog has increased levels of aggression. But of course it's completely necessary that this has to be tested on a human to see if that will work on her. And needless to say, they do it. And even more needless to say is things don't go their way. Now, I don't know about you, but I actually think that's quite an interesting premise, if not an entirely original one. I mean, it's kind of like a Frankenstein story, isn't it? But I found it to be enjoyable, and I haven't seen so many movies with that sort of premise. But obviously it's another way of just leading to the same old thing where an experiment goes wrong and this results in people dying. And yeah, in that regard it is fairly generic, but I kind of liked the setup. I thought that the characters they're not A-list actors. Olivia Wilde actually has done quite a lot of good stuff, but they aren't knocking anything out the park by any means. I mean, they're okay, but they interact with each other fine. As I've said, Mark Duplass is actually surprisingly charismatic. They reinforced the beginning of this story quite effectively, and they got me relatively engaged. Not completely, because their shallowness did sort of permeate through the entire thing, but I did think it wasn't too bad. I thought it was relatively good. And then there's also some disturbing imagery, which was quite a surprise to me. I mean, everything in this movie was a bit of a surprise to me, because I didn't hate it as much as I thought I really, really would. So I was surprised to like it as much as I did, even though it is by no means a fantastic movie. Let's get that out of the way. I didn't love this movie. I barely even liked it, but I did like some parts of it, and I liked it for quite a while before the end bit where the inevitable moment in horror movies where you realise, okay, now people are going to start dying. You saw it in Alien, where it was either Kane gets the chest burster out of him, that's one of the moments, or debatably it's the first time you actually see the alien and you see that Lambert dies. That's when you realise, okay, now stuff's going to happen. In zombie movies, it's when you see the first zombie or the first person dies, it's when you realise that now people are going to die. And they do, but there aren't that many people in this movie, so they don't leave much time for it, because they leave this moment so late in the film. And I saw one review that says they didn't like that just as the film feels like it's getting started, it ends, and I sort of agree with that. And the ending of the film is very abrupt, and it feels like they run out. I mean, they had such a small budget. It feels like they just ran out of money, and they were like, "Oh, we can't afford to keep the cameras on anymore. Turn them off, turn them off." I mean, that's what it felt like to me. And there were many moments early on with the most predictable jump scares. They are just the standard You know, the music goes quiet, the character's looking around slowly. You just, each one of them is so predictable, and as a result, they don't scare you, and so many of them are false. And you know they're going to be false. I mean, there's one thing knowing when a jump scare is going to happen, but knowing whether it's going to be a real one or a fake one, that is bad. That's a bad level of predictability for a horror movie, because hot jump scares can be fun if a pretty shallow way of making your movie into sort of emotional roller coaster. They aren't genuine horror, but they can be a little bit of fun. In this movie, they really aren't. But the thing is, early on this film, those sort of horror elements are mixed up with an okay story that is relatively engaging, in my opinion. And so, despite those bad bits, it kind of is wrapped around something that I was relatively enjoying, so I let them slide. And I won't spoil the movie for you just in case you do want to watch it, but you get a lot of insight. You get insight into what is happening to the character of Zoe. You realise why what's happening to her is happening, essentially, and it's relatively interesting again. It's not great by any means, it's barely even good, but it's not that bad. I don't understand how people have hated this film so much. And I have a couple theories on why that is, and I'm just going to explain them quick. The first is that it's very easy for people to pick on the jump scare horror film. I think it's sometimes too easy to go straight into, that's a jump scare. Oh, this is bad, this is horrible. People have that in their head that you can't do jump scares. That's not necessarily true. And I think from the beginning, when this film fails so badly at scaring you with this tiny jump scare, which is essentially a really small part of the film, people are instantly like, oh, I see where this is going. This isn't scary. And then the next part is that people expect a horror film to be really scary. They don't expect much else from it necessarily. This film isn't scary. I'm going to say that. This film does have some tense moments, sure, definitely, which I thought were quite good, but it was never scary. I never wanted a character to not turn the corner, and sometimes I thought the characters were really dumb. But what I will say, this movie doesn't have a completely contrived and eye-rolling reason why these events happen. Zoe is brought back to life because Mark Duplass' character loves her. They're together. And it makes sense, and you feel bad for him. It isn't played up enough, I thought. The characters kind of move on from that, and it's less of a traumatic experience as it should have been. But regardless, that was actually one of the good parts of the movie, in that I didn't feel like they shouldn't have done it. Obviously, they shouldn't have done it, but you empathise with him, and you understand why he did, and you don't blame him for it. But yeah, as a horror film, in many ways it fails, but as a movie in general, I think it's really not as abysmal as you expect. It's not a Halloween film that you're going to dig out and want to be scared by. It's not even a particularly bad movie that is going to amaze you with how bad it is. I mean, I'm not saying this movie's great, but 14% on Rotten Tomatoes, that is awful, like dreadful sort of crap. I don't understand how it got that. It really don't think it is that bad, but it is definitely not great either. I've said that enough times now. I give the movie a 6 out of 10. It is relatively enjoyable. It is relatively good, but I can't say I particularly enjoyed it. It had me engaged mildly, and that's as far as I'll go with it. A very, very, very tepid recommendation, but honestly, if I must be the outlier in terms of my opinion, the chances are you're going to watch this and you're going to agree with the critical response because it's so overwhelming. I must just be different. But if you do watch this movie, I'd really appreciate it if you commented in the box below and told me if you really think that this movie is deserving of a 14% on Rotten Tomatoes. Can you really justify that when you watch this film? But regardless, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you do see this movie, I hope you get more out of it than I did, and I certainly hope you get more out of it than other people did. But regardless, again, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. If you like this video, please like, favourite, and subscribe. If you want to see more of this, there's going to be so much more coming, and I'll see you in my next review.